After his best friend's funeral, Ryan Miller drove the widow home to a house that once echoed with laughter. Night fell. The silence became suffocating. When he turned to leave, Laura grabbed his hand and asked a question that made his blood run cold. "Can you stay tonight?" He said yes. But hours later, when she trembled and said she couldn't bear the emptiness and wanted him to stay longer, he had to make a decision no one wanted. Does kindness have boundaries? Ryan Miller had known Mark Bennett since college. They met in a carpentry elective neither of them needed, both hung over on a Tuesday morning, and became friends over bad coffee and worse jokes. Mark was the kind of person who made noise wherever he went. Loud laugh, big gestures. The guy who showed up unannounced with pizza and stayed until 3 a.m. talking about nothing important. Ryan was the opposite. Quiet, steady. He worked with his hands, fixed things that broke, and kept his head down. After his wife died 6 years ago, he'd retreated into himself so deeply that most people stopped trying to reach him. But Mark didn't stop. He dragged Ryan out of that dark hole one terrible day at a time. Showed up at his door. Made him eat. Made him talk. Made him remember he had a son who needed him. Laura came into the picture a few years later. She was soft-spoken, thoughtful, the kind of person who listened more than she spoke. Ryan liked her immediately. Not in that way. Just in the way you like someone who feels safe. She fit into their small circle without disrupting it. She laughed at Mark's jokes and asked Ryan about his kid and never made things complicated. She was family. That was it. Mark married her on a Saturday in June. Small ceremony, backyard reception. Ryan stood beside him as best man and felt something close to happiness for the first time in years. He thought maybe life could be good again. Not for him, maybe, but for people he loved. That was enough. The heart attack came without warning. Mark was 34 years old, healthy, no history of anything. He collapsed in the kitchen on a Thursday night while Laura was upstairs. By the time the ambulance arrived, he was already gone. The funeral happened 3 days later. It was small, a handful of relatives, a few co-workers. Laura's parents flew in but left right after the service. Ryan stayed. He didn't know why exactly. Maybe because he owed Mark that much. Maybe because he couldn't stand the thought of Laura walking back into that empty house alone. When the last guest left, Laura stood in the funeral home parking lot, staring at nothing. Her black dress hung loose on her frame. She looked smaller than Ryan remembered, fragile in a way that made his chest tighten. Ryan approached slowly, hands in his pockets. He didn't know what to say. There were no good words for this. Laura turned to him, her eyes red and hollowed out. She tried to smile, but it collapsed halfway. Ryan gestured toward his truck without speaking. She nodded and followed. The drive back to her house was silent. Ryan kept his eyes on the road. Laura stared out the window, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The house appeared at the end of the street. A small 2-story with white shutters and a front porch Mark had built himself. It looked the same as always, but everything about it felt wrong now. Ryan pulled into the driveway and shut off the engine. Neither of them moved. The silence stretched out, heavy and suffocating. Finally, Laura opened her door and stepped out. Ryan followed, unsure if he should leave or stay, or what the protocol was for this kind of thing. Laura unlocked the front door and walked inside. The house was dark. She didn't turn on any lights. Ryan stood in the doorway, 1 foot in, 1 foot out. He watched her move through the living room like a ghost, her fingers trailing along the back of the couch, the edge of the coffee table, the frame of a photo on the wall. She stopped in the middle of the room and just stood there. Her shoulders started to shake. Ryan stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He didn't say anything. He didn't touch her. He just stood there because he didn't know what else to do. After a long time, Laura turned around. Her face was wet. Her voice came out cracked and small. She asked if he wanted coffee. Ryan said sure, even though he didn't. She disappeared into the kitchen, and he heard the sound of cabinets opening, the clatter of mugs, the hiss of the coffee maker. He sat down on the couch and looked around the room. Everything was exactly as Mark had left it. His jacket on the back of a chair, his boots by the door, a book open on the side table, pages down, waiting for him to come back and finish it. Laura returned with 2 mugs and handed one to Ryan. She sat down on the opposite end of the couch, curling her legs beneath her. They sipped their coffee in silence. It was too hot and too bitter, but neither of them said anything. Eventually, Laura spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper. She said she didn't know how to do this, didn't know how to be in this house without him, didn't know how to sleep in their bed or eat at their table or walk past his things without falling apart. Ryan listened. He didn't try to fix it. He knew better than that. Some things couldn't be fixed. The coffee grew cold. The room grew darker. Ryan glanced at his watch. It was almost 9. He needed to get home. His son was with a neighbor, and he didn't like to leave him too long. He set his mug down on the table and started to stand. Laura's hand shot out and grabbed his wrist. The movement was sudden, desperate. Ryan froze. Her fingers were cold and trembling. She looked up at him with wide, panicked eyes. She asked if he could stay. Just for tonight. Just so she didn't have to be alone in the house. Her voice broke on the last word, and she looked away, ashamed. Ryan stood there, her hand still wrapped around his wrist, and felt the weight of the question settle over him like a stone. He thought about Mark, about the promise he'd made to himself at the funeral to take care of Laura, to make sure she was okay. But he also thought about boundaries, about what was right and what wasn't, about how easy it would be to cross a line without meaning to. Laura wasn't asking for anything inappropriate. She was asking for company, for someone to be in the house so the silence didn't swallow her whole. That was all. Ryan told himself that. He told himself it was fine. He sat back down. Laura let go of his wrist and folded her hands in her lap. She thanked him, her voice so quiet he barely heard it. Ryan nodded and pulled out his phone to text the neighbor, letting her know he'd be late picking up his son. The hours crawled by. Laura talked in circles, her words tumbling out in waves. She talked about Mark, about their first date, about the way he used to burn toast every Sunday morning and pretend it was intentional, about the trip they were supposed to take next month, about all the things they'd never get to do now. Ryan listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer platitudes. He just sat there and let her speak until the words ran out. Around midnight, Laura's voice finally trailed off. She leaned back against the couch, exhausted. Ryan stood and grabbed a blanket from the hallway closet. He handed it to her and told her to get some sleep. She looked at him like she wanted to argue, but didn't have the energy. Ryan took the other blanket and stretched out on the couch. It was too short for his frame, and the cushions were lumpy, but he didn't care. He closed his eyes and listened to the sound of Laura's breathing slow and deepen. He didn't sleep. He lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and wondered if he'd made the right choice. Wondered what Mark would think. Wondered if kindness had limits, and if so, where they were. The night dragged on. The house creaked and settled around them. And somewhere in the silence, Ryan realized this was only the beginning. Ryan woke to the sound of movement in the kitchen. For a moment, he forgot where he was. Then he saw the blanket twisted around his legs. The coffee table in front of him, the framed photo of Mark and Laura on the mantel. He sat up slowly, his back stiff from the couch. Laura was standing at the counter, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. She was still wearing yesterday's clothes. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot. She looked like she hadn't slept at all. Ryan folded the blanket and set it on the armrest. He checked his phone. 6:30 in the morning. 3 messages from the neighbor asking if everything was okay. He typed a quick reply and promised to pick up his son within the hour. Laura turned around and handed him a mug. She didn't say good morning. She didn't say anything. She just stood there, holding her own mug in both hands, staring at the steam rising from it. Ryan thanked her and took a sip. The coffee was weak and too sweet. She'd added sugar without asking. Mark used to take his coffee the same way. Ryan wondered if she'd done it out of habit, or if she'd just forgotten how he liked it. They stood in the kitchen in silence. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, soft and pale. Outside, a car drove past. A dog barked. The world kept moving like nothing had changed. Laura set her mug down on the counter and crossed her arms over her chest. She looked at Ryan with an expression he couldn't quite read. Tired? Maybe. Or lost. She told him she appreciated him staying, that it helped, that she didn't know what she would have done if she'd been alone. Ryan nodded. He said it wasn't a problem, that he was glad he could help, that if she needed anything, she should call him. He meant it, but he also meant it as a closing statement. A polite way to say he needed to leave now. Laura didn't move. She just stood there, her arms still crossed, her eyes fixed on him. Then she said something that made his stomach drop. She said she didn't think she could do another night alone, that the house felt too big and too quiet and too full of him, that every corner reminded her of Mark and she couldn't breathe, that when Ryan was there, it was easier. Just a little, just enough. Ryan set his mug down carefully on the counter. He could feel the weight of what she was asking without her having to say it directly. She wanted him to stay again, maybe longer than one night. Maybe until she could figure out how to exist in this house without falling apart. He told her gently that he understood, that grief was terrible and suffocating, and he knew what it felt like to be drowning in it. But he also told her he had a son, responsibilities, a life that didn't stop just because someone else's had. Laura's face crumpled. She turned away and gripped the edge of the counter. Her shoulders shook, but she didn't make a sound. Ryan stood there, helpless, feeling like he was abandoning her, like he was doing exactly what everyone else had done, showing up for the funeral and then disappearing. But he also knew that staying wasn't the answer. Not like this. Not in a way that made her dependent on his presence instead of learning to stand on her own. He'd been down that road before. After his wife died, he'd clung to anyone who would let him. He'd mistaken company for healing. It had taken him years to realize that grief didn't work that way, that no one could carry it for you. He walked over to Laura and put a hand on her shoulder. She flinched but didn't pull away. He told her she was stronger than she thought, that it wouldn't feel like it for a long time, but eventually it would get easier, that she needed to let people help her, but not in a way that kept her stuck. Laura turned around. Her eyes were red and wet. She asked him what that meant, asked him if he was saying she was broken, if he thought she was weak for not being able to handle this. Ryan shook his head. He told her that wasn't what he meant at all, that asking for help wasn't weakness, but leaning on someone so hard that you couldn't stand without them was dangerous. For both people. Laura stared at him. Then she asked if that was what he thought she was doing, using him as a crutch. Ryan didn't answer right away. He thought about how to say it without hurting her more than she already was. He told her he thought she was in pain, that pain made people do things they wouldn't normally do, that it was okay to need support, but it had to be the right kind. Laura wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She said she didn't know what the right kind was, that she didn't know how to do any of this, that Mark was supposed to be here and he wasn't, and she didn't have a plan for that. Ryan told her no one had a plan for it. That grief didn't come with instructions, but that she had people who cared about her, family, friends, people who could help in ways that were healthier than him, sleeping on her couch every night. Laura looked down at the floor. She said most of those people had already left, that her parents couldn't handle being around her right now because it was too painful for them, that Mark's family blamed her somehow, like she should have seen it coming, that she didn't have anyone else. Ryan felt the guilt twist in his chest. He knew what it was like to feel alone, to feel like the world had moved on and left you behind. But he also knew that staying here, night after night, wouldn't fix that. It would only delay the inevitable. He told her he'd help her find a grief support group, that there were people who specialized in this, who knew how to guide someone through it without making it worse. Laura didn't respond. She just stared at the floor, her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold herself together. Ryan glanced at the clock on the wall. Almost 7. He needed to leave. He told Laura he had to go get his son, that he'd check in on her later, that she could call him if she needed anything. Laura nodded, but didn't look up. Ryan grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair and walked toward the door. His hand was on the knob when Laura spoke again. She said she understood, that she knew he had his own life, that she didn't want to be a burden. But then her voice broke, and she said she was scared. Scared of being in the house, scared of the nights, scared of what would happen if she was alone with her thoughts for too long. Ryan stood there with his back to her, his hand still on the door. He thought about Mark, about the way Mark had shown up for him when no one else did, about the promise he'd made to himself to look after Laura. But he also thought about his son, about the neighbor who'd been watching him for almost 12 hours now, about the fine line between helping someone and enabling them to stay stuck. He turned around. Laura was standing in the middle of the kitchen, looking small and fragile and utterly lost. Ryan told her he couldn't stay again tonight, that it wasn't fair to her, or to him, or to his kid, that she needed to start finding other ways to cope. Laura's face went blank. She nodded slowly, like she'd expected this, like she'd known all along that he'd leave eventually. She told him it was fine, that she'd figure it out. Her voice was flat and distant. Ryan felt the guilt claw at him, but he forced himself to walk out the door anyway. He climbed into his truck and sat there for a moment, staring at the house. He could see Laura through the kitchen window, standing in the same spot, unmoving. He thought about going back inside, about staying just one more night, but he knew where that road led. He started the engine and drove away. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Ryan picked up his son and took him to breakfast. They went to the park, played catch, did all the normal things they always did. But Ryan's mind was somewhere else. He kept thinking about Laura alone in that house, kept wondering if he'd made the right call. That night, after his son was asleep, Ryan sat on his own couch and stared at his phone. No messages from Laura, no missed calls. He told himself that was a good sign, that she was okay, that she was figuring it out. But deep down, he didn't believe it. 2 days passed, then 3. Ryan texted Laura twice, short messages, asking how she was doing, reminding her that he was there if she needed to talk. She responded both times with one-word answers. Fine, okay, thanks. On the 4th day, Ryan drove by her house on his way home from a job. The curtains were drawn. The porch light was off even though it was almost dark. The mailbox was overflowing. He sat in his truck at the end of the street, staring at the house, and felt the dread settle in his stomach. He called her. It rang 6 times before going to voicemail. He left a message asking her to call him back. She didn't. Ryan tried to tell himself it was normal, that she needed space, that she was processing things in her own way. But he couldn't shake the image of her standing in that kitchen, looking so lost and scared. That night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He thought about his wife, about the weeks after she died when he'd locked himself in the house and refused to see anyone, about how Mark had forced his way in and dragged him back to the world, about how close he'd come to disappearing completely. He thought about Laura alone in that house right now, about what she might be thinking, about what she might do if the weight became too much. At 2 in the morning, Ryan sat up in bed. He grabbed his phone and called her again. No answer. He texted her, told her he was worried, told her to please just let him know she was okay. Nothing. Ryan got out of bed and paced the room. He thought about driving over there, about banging on the door until she answered. But he also thought about boundaries, about the line he'd already walked up to, about how showing up in the middle of the night might send the wrong message. He sat back down on the edge of the bed and put his head in his hands. He didn't know what to do, didn't know if he was being paranoid or if his instincts were right. Didn't know if helping meant going back or staying away. The guilt was overwhelming. The fear was worse. Ryan looked at his phone one more time. Still nothing. He thought about Mark, about what Mark would do if their positions were reversed, and he realized, with a sinking feeling, that Mark wouldn't have left in the first place. But Ryan wasn't Mark, and maybe that was the problem. He set the phone down on the nightstand and lay back down. He stared at the ceiling until the sun came up, and the whole time he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd made a terrible mistake. By the 5th day, Ryan couldn't take it anymore. He dropped his son off at school and drove straight to Laura's house. The morning was gray and cold, the kind of weather that made everything feel heavier. He pulled into the driveway and stared at the front door. The curtains were still drawn, the mailbox still overflowing. Nothing had changed. Ryan got out of the truck and walked up to the porch. He knocked on the door. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. He tried the doorbell. The sound echoed inside the house, but no one came. Ryan pulled out his phone and called her. He could hear it ringing inside, faint and distant. It rang, and then went to voicemail. He hung up and knocked again. This time he called her name through the door. His voice sounded too loud in the quiet street. Finally, he heard movement. Footsteps. Slow and uneven. The door opened a crack, and Laura stood there, half hidden in shadow. She looked worse than Ryan had ever seen her. Her hair was unwashed and tangled. Her clothes were wrinkled like she'd been sleeping in them. Her eyes were hollow and red-rimmed. Ryan asked if he could come in. Laura didn't answer. She just turned and walked back into the house, leaving the door open. Ryan took that as permission and followed her inside. The house was a mess. Dishes piled in the sink. Empty mugs on every surface. The curtains closed in every room, blocking out the daylight. It smelled stale, like the air hadn't moved in days. Laura shuffled into the living room and sat down on the couch, pulling a blanket over her legs. She stared at the wall, her face blank. Ryan stood in the doorway, trying to figure out what to say. He asked if she'd eaten anything. Laura shrugged. He asked if she'd been outside. She shook her head. He asked if she'd talked to anyone. She didn't respond at all. Ryan sat down on the edge of the coffee table facing her. He told her he was worried, that shutting herself in like this wasn't healthy. That she needed help. Real help. Not just someone checking in on her every few days. Laura finally looked at him. Her voice came out flat and exhausted. She said she knew. That she'd been trying to hold it together but couldn't. That the house was suffocating her. That she couldn't sleep in the bedroom anymore because it smelled like Mark. That she couldn't eat because nothing tasted right. That she'd been sitting on the couch for days, waiting for something to change. But nothing did. Ryan felt the weight of her words settle over him. He understood that feeling. The paralysis. The sense that the world had stopped, and you were stuck in the wreckage, unable to move forward or back. He told her he got it. That after his wife died, he'd done the same thing. Locked himself away. Refused help. Convinced himself he could white-knuckle his way through it. Laura asked what changed. Ryan told her Mark changed it. That Mark had forced him to get up, get out, and start living again even when he didn't want to. That it hadn't been easy or fast, but it had worked because Mark didn't let him stay stuck. Laura's face crumpled. She said Mark wasn't here anymore, that no one was going to do that for her. Ryan told her that wasn't true, that he was here, that he wasn't going anywhere, but that she had to meet him halfway. She had to be willing to accept help in a way that actually helped. Laura wiped her eyes with the edge of the blanket. She asked what that meant. Ryan told her it meant getting connected with people who knew how to navigate grief, a support group, a therapist. People who could give her tools instead of just sitting with her in the dark. Laura said she didn't know if she could do that, didn't know if she could sit in a room full of strangers and talk about Mark. Ryan told her she didn't have to do it alone, that he'd help her find the right group, that he'd even go with her to the first meeting if that made it easier. Laura looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded, so slightly he almost missed it. Ryan felt something like relief wash over him. He stood up and opened the curtains. Light flooded the room. Laura flinched and turned away, but she didn't ask him to close them again. Ryan spent the rest of the morning cleaning. He washed the dishes, took out the trash, opened the windows to let fresh air in. Laura stayed on the couch, watching him with a distant expression. She didn't help, but she didn't stop him either. When the house looked halfway livable again, Ryan made her lunch. Nothing fancy, just a sandwich and some fruit. He set it on the coffee table in front of her and told her to eat. Laura picked at it without much interest, but she ate a few bites. It was something. Ryan sat down across from her and pulled out his phone. He searched for grief support groups in the area, found one that met twice a week at a community center downtown. He showed Laura the information. She glanced at it and then looked away. Ryan told her he'd take her to the next meeting, that it was in 2 days, that she didn't have to talk if she didn't want to. She just had to show up. Laura didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either. Over the next 2 days, Ryan checked in on her every morning and evening. He didn't stay long. Just enough to make sure she was eating, that she was getting out of bed, that she was still trying. Laura was quiet and withdrawn, but she answered the door. She let him in. That was progress. On the night of the support group meeting, Ryan picked her up at 6:30. Laura was waiting on the porch, wearing clean clothes and a jacket. Her hair was brushed. She looked tired, but present. Ryan told her she looked good. She didn't respond, but she got in the truck without hesitating. The community center was a low brick building with fluorescent lights and worn linoleum floors. The meeting room was small, with folding chairs arranged in a circle. There were 7 other people already there, some older, some younger, all carrying the same weight Laura was. Laura sat down next to Ryan, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. A woman in her 50s led the group. She introduced herself and explained how the meetings worked. Everyone shared if they wanted to. No one was forced. The goal was just to be there, to know you weren't alone. People started talking. A man in his 60s who'd lost his wife of 40 years. A younger woman whose brother had died in a car accident. An older woman whose son had taken his own life. Their stories were different, but the pain was the same. Laura listened, her eyes fixed on the floor. When it was her turn, Laura shook her head. The woman leading the group told her that was okay, that she could just listen tonight. Laura nodded, relief visible on her face. Ryan sat beside her and said nothing. He didn't share either. He was just there as support. But he listened to the stories and felt the familiar ache in his chest. The reminder that grief was universal, that everyone in this room understood what it meant to lose someone and keep living anyway. After the meeting ended, people lingered, talking quietly in small groups. Laura stood up and walked outside without saying anything. Ryan followed her. She stood on the sidewalk, staring up at the sky. The air was cold and crisp. Her breath came out in small clouds. Ryan asked if she was okay. Laura said she didn't know. That hearing other people's stories made her feel less alone, but also made the loss feel more real. Like it wasn't just happening to her, like it was everywhere. Ryan told her that was the point. That grief wasn't something you could outrun or ignore, that the only way through it was to face it, to sit with it, to let other people sit with you. Laura looked at him, and for the first time in days, her eyes weren't completely empty. She thanked him. Ryan told her she didn't need to thank him, that this was what people did for each other. Laura said most people didn't, that most people showed up for the funeral and then disappeared. Ryan told her he wasn't most people. They drove back to her house in silence. When Ryan pulled into the driveway, Laura didn't get out right away. She sat there, staring at the house. Then she said she thought she could do it. Go to another meeting. Try to keep going. Ryan told her he believed her. Laura got out of the truck and walked up to the porch. She turned around before going inside and waved. Ryan waved back. He waited until she was inside, and the lights came on before he drove away. Over the next few weeks, Laura went to every meeting. Ryan drove her to the first 3, and then she started going on her own. She started seeing a therapist, started reaching out to old friends, started doing small things, like going to the grocery store and cooking dinner and sitting on the porch in the evenings. Ryan checked in on her regularly, but the visits were shorter now. She didn't need him to stay, didn't need him to fill the silence. She was learning to live with it. One Saturday afternoon, Ryan stopped by with his son. Laura was in the front yard, pulling weeds from the garden Mark had planted. She looked up when they arrived and smiled. It was a small smile, tentative and fragile, but it was real. Ryan's son ran over and asked if he could help. Laura handed him a small trowel and showed him which plants to leave alone. They worked together for a while. The kid chattering about school and cartoons and nothing important. Laura listened and laughed at the right moments and looked almost like herself again. Ryan stood on the porch and watched them. He thought about Mark, about how much his friend would have wanted this, would have wanted Laura to keep going, to find a way to be okay. Ryan felt a quiet sense of peace settle over him. He'd done the right thing, not the easy thing, but the right thing. When it was time to leave, Laura walked them to the truck. She thanked Ryan again, told him she didn't know what she would have done without him. Ryan told her she would have figured it out, that she was stronger than she thought. Laura said maybe, but she was glad she didn't have to find out. Ryan drove home with his son asleep in the back seat. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the road. He thought about boundaries, about kindness, about the fine line between helping someone and doing the work for them. He thought about Mark and hoped, wherever he was, that he understood, that he knew Ryan had tried, that he'd kept his promise in the only way that mattered. Ryan pulled into his driveway and carried his son inside. He put him to bed and sat down on the couch. The house was quiet, but it was a comfortable quiet, the kind that felt like home. He picked up his phone and saw a text from Laura. Just 2 words. "Thank you." Ryan smiled and set the phone down. He didn't need to respond. She already knew.